Hello, and welcome to our US with Oz speaker series event on disinformation. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet today across Australia, Ngunnawal land here in Canberra, and pay our respect to their elders past and present. My name is Samantha Juster, and I am the Public Engagement Attaché at the United States Embassy in Canberra, Australia. It's my pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Darren Linvill, who joins us from the Clemson University in South Carolina. Darren is lead researcher in the Clemson University Media Forensics Hub, where he researches state-sponsored disinformation on social media, focusing on the strategy and tactics of coordinated information operations. In 2020, he partnered with the Commission on Presidential Debates to monitor social media conversations around the US presidential debates. He has worked with Twitter and Facebook to suspend hundreds of social media accounts belonging to a range of bad actors, including the Russian Internet Research Agency. In addition to his many academic publications, Dr. Linvill has written for Foreign Affairs, The Washington Post, and Rolling Stone. Today, Darren will lead us in a discussion about how misinformation and disinformation are wielded to misinform and manipulate online audiences. He will detail methods of state-backed disinformation and their threats to democracy. Following Darren's presentation, we'll turn it over to Q&A. If you have a question to ask, just drop it in the Q&A window at any stage during today's discussion, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. And lastly, before I turn it over to Darren, a quick audience poll. We'll put it up on your screens now, and please choose the answer that best applies to you. How confident are you that you can recognize an online troll? Thank you for your responses. Please keep your answers in mind while watching the presentation. And with that, I'll turn it over to Darren.
Thank you so much, Samantha. It's a real pleasure to be with you all this morning. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen real quick, if you just give me one moment. Can you see that? I've got it on the screen here, a couple of recent stories that were prevalent in Australia. Y'all are far more familiar with these stories than I am, but each of these stories was either only partially true or untrue, and yet they picked up a great deal of traction on social media and beyond social media as well. Misinformation is a huge problem, but it's not exactly the problem that I'm here to talk about this evening. I'm here to talk about disinformation. It is very difficult to separate those two things. Misinformation is misinformation that's simply false. It's very often spread by people who are unaware they're spreading false information, and that's very, very possible with either of these stories here. Whereas disinformation is either information that's spread through a false mechanism or information that is purposely false. And in the Venn diagram of those two things, there's obviously a lot of overlap, and disinformation operators even often use stories that may begin simply as misinformation and use it to different ends for their own means, by their own means. So I got my start studying disinformation about 4 years ago, when myself and my colleague Patrick Warren here at Clemson started studying the work of the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, Russia. Now that top left photo is a photo of their headquarters starting in early 2014 through 2016. It was operated by an individual named Yevgeny Prigozhin. He's known as Putin's chef because he got his start as Putin's caterer made a lot of money doing that, made a lot of good friends, and soon became a billionaire oligarch in his own right. The picture on the bottom right, however, is the headquarters of the Internet Research Agency more recently. They moved into that building after the 2016 presidential election here in the United States. You'll notice that it's a bigger building. It's got room to expand. It's in a nicer part of town. It's not that squat Soviet era style of their old headquarters. And expand they did, because regardless of what you think their effect may have been, there was certainly the impression that they were effective, and resources follows that perception. So we were lucky enough here at Clemson to have a tool to get access to some of the tweets. Now, the House Intelligence Committee here in the United States made public data that they were given from Twitter, the names of a little over 3,000 Twitter accounts that Twitter identified as being associated with the Internet Research Agency. Twitter could have given America that data, those actual tweets, but at the time they didn't think that was in their best interest. Fortunately, here at Clemson, we had a tool to get access to those tweets, and we downloaded about 3 million of them and made that and analyzed them in detail and made that data available to other researchers and journalists so that we could better understand the work that Russia was doing, targeting conversations here in the United States, but not just in the United States, globally. Within that data set, there were not only a couple of million English language tweets, but there were also tweets in German, in Spanish, French, Arabic, and obviously mostly in Russian. Twitter later released a larger data set that went back farther in time than we were able to go. And there were something like 6 million tweets in Russia compared to 3 million in all other languages. And I want to talk just about a thin slice of the analysis that we did on what it was the Russians were doing on Twitter in 2015 and 2016. We identified 4 specific things. 2 of them I want to talk about briefly. 4 types of trolls. We took all of those tweets and we categorized the accounts into 4 categories. The 2 main ones were left trolls and right trolls. The right trolls were doing what you see here on the screen. They were nationalist, they were racist, they were anti-immigrant, pro-Second Amendment, pro-gun, and they looked exactly like what you see here. There's just a couple of examples. Gunslinger Girl was a pro-Second Amendment account with tens of thousands of followers, doing what a lot of troll accounts do, which is look like an attractive young woman. 10GOP had about 150,000 followers when it was suspended, and it was pretending to be the unofficial Twitter account of the Tennessee GOP, and it was incredibly effective. In the month before the election, it had over 100,000 mentions on Twitter alone. That doesn't even include cross-platform engagement that it had. So, but they just weren't operating on the right. These accounts were obviously very pro-Trump, coalescing support around Donald Trump and attacking the left. They were also operating on the left. Here's a couple of examples of the type of accounts that they had operating in 2017 and 2018 on the left. These are accounts that we here at Clemson were able to identify as being operated by the Internet Research Agency, but they're very similar to what they were doing in 2016 as well. I could have as easily showed you those accounts, and they would have been unmistakable from the type of thing that they were doing. Polite Melanie there on the left was one of my favorites. She's very typical of what the Russians were doing, purporting to be a Black American woman. But Polite Melanie, boy, she was building a brand. She was mentioned on CNN, taking quotes from her account. She had a scary mommy blog post written about her. If there's any parents on the call, you might know Scary Mommy. Most importantly, though, and what I was most proud of Polite Melanie for, was that she won in October of 2018 the Chicago Tribune's Tweet of the Week contest, voted on by the readers of the Chicago Tribune. She was adding almost 10,000 followers a month by the time we worked with Twitter to suspend her account just before the midterm elections here in the United States in 2018. Tyra Jackson was active in 2019, the account there on the right. And this is one of the most effective IRA tweets I've ever seen, with over almost 300,000 likes, 60,000 retweets. And I included that one mostly because it's an example of what you might not expect a troll to do. It's true. It's factual. It's heartwarming. It's a positive mention about Warwick Dunn. Tony Dungy, Warwick Dunn's coach, actually retweeted that post because it was such a heartwarming post, and it really connected with its audience. But that post ultimately was just there to help Tyra connect with her audience, gain followers, gain traction, gain credibility, and therefore spread her more devious messages more effectively. Now, obviously, the IRA wasn't just active on Twitter in 2016 and beyond. They've been active across multiple platforms. Instagram, they've been most effective on. Facebook, obviously, even Pinterest. I read in a report that they were even active on Pokemon Go back in 2015. But I included this image here of the Black Matters US landing page of their website. This is an organization that was run by the IRA in 2016 and early 2017. It was one of the most prolific Black Lives Matter organizations operating in the United States. But it wasn't operating, it was operating in the United States. They put on actual events, but it was operated out of St. Petersburg, Russia. And they had this landing page, of course. They had Twitter, Instagram, Facebook pages, as you see in the upper right there. They had a regular a newspaper that went out, and even a place where you could donate to their cause on their website. Tens of thousands of followers across all of their platforms. And this is why they were doing it, fundamentally, we believe, why they were operating on both the left and the right. Their left-leaning accounts obviously weren't for Donald Trump. They weren't supporting Donald Trump, but nor were they supporting Hillary Clinton in 2016. What they were doing was trying to make people as extreme as possible in both directions. This image is an image I borrowed from a colleague of mine at Washington University named Kate Starboard. She took some existing data that she had where she was plotting from Twitter data conversations around Black Lives Matter. The conversation on the left, the slightly bigger conversation, is conversations using the hashtag Black Lives Matter, supportive of that movement, supportive of that cause. The conversation on the right are tweets from accounts using the hashtag Blue Lives Matter, talking about Black Lives Matter in a very different way. And you see that these conversations are not overlapping in any way. You can almost see them pulling apart from one another. They're not engaged. They're two separate conversation silos. And what Kate did that was brilliant was she took this massive existing data set that she had of these two different conversations and the accounts involved in those conversations. And she mapped out, once the House Intelligence Committee released the name of the Russian accounts, she looked to see where those accounts were in the conversation. And that's what the orange is in this image. You can almost see that orange pulling the conversation farther apart from one another, pulling these two sides in directions where they won't be able to engage with one another, can't have open and honest conversations, and where doubt and mistrust can only grow more. That's what the Russians were doing in 2016, and what disinformation continues to do across platforms on social media and elsewhere today. These are accounts that were operated by the Russian IRAs as recently as 2020, just before the election here in the United States. They were doing exactly the same thing, purporting to be both right-leaning pro-Trump supporters and left-leaning, mostly pro-Bernie Sanders supporters, he being the more extreme left-leaning candidate. And you'll see that, again, they were purporting to be parts of very particular ethnic groups, particular social identity groups. What I think is particularly interesting is about this array of profiles that I have here is that you can also see how their tactics have evolved, because 4 of these people don't exist at all. I mean, obviously Whitney Miller and Danny Hill, those don't exist. Those aren't even purported to be real photographs. But Harmony Anders, that Gonzalez, David Lang, and Carrie Kern are all computer-generated photos of human beings. There are a few tells that let you know that those are computer-generated images, but a typical person wouldn't, I think, bat an eye at those images to know that those are humans that don't actually exist in the real world. I wanted to dive in on one of these accounts, that Gonzalez, just to give you a little bit of a better idea of exactly what these accounts were doing in 2020. They didn't exist for very long before we were able to identify them and work with Twitter to suspend these accounts. But you see, even in its relatively short lifetime, it got several thousand followers and was having a meaningful effect on the conversation. This Latino in Nevada here, for any Spanish speakers, there's a tell even in its name that it was inauthentic, because it should be Latina in Nevada, not Latino in Nevada. But Latino in Nevada here was trying to make Bernie Sanders more popular in a very particular ethnic group that he didn't traditionally have a lot of support in. They were doing this within the Black community as well as within the LGBTQ community. And you see that with her tweet right there. It was going out of its way, and again, in a positive way, to engage in this community in a very authentic way, based off of what it was retweeting, the message it was reporting, it was repeating, and who it was engaging with. But again, it was also extreme. The Russian trolls have a long history of being extreme and attacking literally any moderate candidate. And in 2020, the most moderate candidate was, of course, Joe Biden. And all of these accounts, both on the left and the right, went out of their way to attack Joe Biden. While we were doing this work before the 2020 election to identify these Russian trolls, we found a variety of other trolls. Some of them we were able to guess who might be running them, but some of them we weren't. And some of those that we weren't able to identify who was running them were just as effective as the Russian trolls, including a small subset of about half a dozen accounts or so that we found that were doing exactly the same thing that these Russian trolls were doing, that were pretending to be Australians, including Florence Walters here, who was pretending to be from Port Melbourne. She was engaged in conservative Twitter, in conversations both in Australia and in the United States. And you see, I mean, she was more effective than Latino in Nevada in getting followers and spreading a very particular message. But again, we worked with Twitter to shut down her and her friends. Was never able to identify where she got her profile image, who that was in reality, or if that person was even Australian. So enough about Russians. If I was Australian, I wouldn't be nearly as concerned as the Russians, even though the Russians did talk a fair bit about Australia. In the data set, there's several thousand mentions of Australia. But if I was an Australian, I'd be far more concerned about what the Chinese were doing on my social media platforms. I've done a little bit of work looking at what China has done and what they very much continue to do on social media. And I first started to look at Chinese disinformation back in 2019. There was a tweet from Daryl Morey in October of 2019. Daryl Morey was the general manager of a National Basketball Association's team, the Houston Rockets here in the United States. And the upper left-hand corner of this page is his tweet, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." He had the audacity to say something good about democracy in Hong Kong. Given that the NBA was trying to do business with China, China did not take this tweet kindly. And I worked with some journalists at the Wall Street Journal in the week following this tweet to look at conversations around Daryl Morey. And what happened was Chinese trolls came at Daryl Morey and came at him hard. The image in the lower left there is an image, a graph that the Wall Street Journal put together from some data that we supplied them. And that graph charts out 150 or so thousand mentions of Daryl Morey, people who typed in at Daryl Morey in the week after his "Fight for Freedom, Stand with Hong Kong" tweet. And the light blue in those images, in that image, is tweets that came from people who were probably authentic. And the darker blue and yellow color represent tweets that came from accounts that were probably inauthentic. We measured inauthenticity in here by a very easy metric, and that was just how long had the account existed. Because what happened here was the Chinese created thousands of accounts, over 2,000 new accounts a day for a week. And the first thing that those accounts did was tweet at Daryl Morey, usually something nasty about his mother. This was an intimidation tactic, pure and simple, first of all. But it's also simply a tactic by China to have a presence in the conversation, to take over the conversation even. China obviously doesn't allow their own people onto Twitter. So if they want the Chinese perspective, and in particular, the perspective that the government wants represented on the platform, then it often has to be created whole cloth, or they have various youth groups and pro-government organizations do it on their behalf. And that's what we think happened here. Thousands of new accounts were created in order to bully not only Daryl Morey, but the NBA. Huge business implications here for what China did in this case. And then on the right, you see just a selection of the type of thing that these Chinese trolls were tweeting at Daryl Morey. They, most of it wasn't very creative. Like I said, it was mostly attacking Daryl Morey's mom. But with a lot of it, they put a lot of time and effort into the images, into the memes, and into the messages. It wasn't just always cut and paste the same message. It was tens and tens of thousands of original tweets targeting this man. And a lot of those accounts are still active on the platform today. The good news is, if you're concerned about Chinese disinformation, is that they're not very good at it compared to the Russians or even the Iranians. The bad news is that they're getting better and they're getting more creative. And the real bad news is that they are prolific, especially if you compare with how they engage and where they engage compared to other bad actors that are active on social media. This is an account that an open source researcher that I follow on Twitter identified the other day, and I dived in to explore it a little more. And Jessica Clare purports to be a reporter at The Guardian. She is no such thing. She's not a reporter at The Guardian. In fact, almost all 32,000 of her followers are bought and paid for using malware. In this case, she was an account that was built up using malware. And we dived into, and this account that I follow on Twitter that was discussing Jessica Clare was outlining these things. And I was curious, okay, you had somebody created this account and, went to a lot of effort to get her all these followers, hadn't been active very long. Why was she there? Turns out she was probably Chinese. Because when you looked at some of the accounts that she was trying to raise the profile of and what they were discussing, it was a lot of garbage Chinese disinformation propaganda accounts. And here's just a selection of the accounts that Claire was connected to, just 1 degree of separation away from, and was trying to raise the profile of. Coincidentally, this same network was identified just today by security firm FireEye, as well as Google's security team, as part of an ongoing disinformation operation out of China, connected to a campaign that's been going on since 2019, a campaign that the Australian Strategic Policy Institute has done some research on. You'll see that none of this is particularly compelling. If you said, I think I could identify a troll, these might be the accounts that you would think that you could identify. Owen Jones still has the default profile image. Marisha here is a male, despite being named Marisha. And if you look really closely at that image, it's just a stock photo. But again, these accounts don't necessarily have to be good. They're out here to take over a hashtag, to make sure that if you're engaging with a particular hashtag, that this is the message you're going to see. Disinformation doesn't always have to be quality to be effective. There's value just in large numbers. You see that with what they did with Daryl Morey, and you see that with these messages around Guo. These particular accounts are attacking a Chinese dissident named Guo, who works closely with Bannon here in the United States. But this same campaign, not just active on Twitter. Again, obviously, we were identifying, these same accounts on Pinterest, Instagram, and a large array of various blog platforms, places like DeviantArt and other similar pages were hosting the same imagery. All of it, brand new accounts, not getting a lot of traction, but they are still getting better. And obviously, no small amount of effort went into some of these images. I could show you, another 100 images that look similar to this. They've got an art department, clearly, just like the Russians did or do. So before we move on to questions, there's 2 things I want to touch on real quick about the current and future state of social media disinformation. And the first is the growing prevalence of for-hire disinformation. The cost of entry for social media disinformation has always been low. That's fundamentally one reason it exists. It's because the cost of entry is low. But it's gotten even lower because you can just hire a marketing company to do it for you now. And lots of politicians in Latin America, the global South are doing just that. But not just those places, also Afghanistan. Farhad Hussein here is an account that we found when we started to dive in a little bit on Taliban Twitter and Taliban social media. As you may be aware, there's been some conversation about it recently. Taliban has a very prominent propaganda campaign on social media. They even govern to an extent using various social media platforms. Farhad Hussein, in the past several weeks, certainly since the Taliban took the city, has been tweeting like crazy the official outlets of the Taliban. You see here just one example of something Farhad tweeted. This is the account of the spokesman of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. So party line account, and that's all Farhad does. He's not necessarily doing it because anybody, Farhad only has 4 followers, and those are probably fake. But he's there to serve a very particular disinformation purpose, and that is to make the Islamic State, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan look more legitimate, but just by simply giving it retweets and likes. That's the purpose of his account. If you want to see Chinese disinformation, the easiest place to go find a fake Chinese account is to look at who's retweeting Chinese consulates and embassies around the globe. It's very often fake accounts. Farhad's an example of that kind of thing. And the reason I'm bringing Farhad up in the context of disinformation for hire is because when we went to see Farhad's history just a couple of months ago, back in May, this is what Farhad was tweeting. He was tweeting esports, and not in Pashtun, not even in English, in Japanese. So it's this pretty likely sign that Farhad is not what he seems to be, and B is a for hire account. Not terribly difficult to find this sort of thing if you look under the right rock on social media. So that is a growing and prevalent problem. The low cost of entry for disinformation for actors around the globe. And it's not just state actors, but political actors, even corporate actors, I'm sure are starting to engage in the same kind of activity. Because they're using the same techniques that marketing companies have been using since social media was first developed. The other important thing that I want to point out is the prominence of domestic disinformation. Most disinformation is in fact for domestic consumption. Most disinformation from state actors at any rate. Twitter keeps an ongoing data set of accounts they've identified from various state actors. And if you look closely at those data sets, you see very quickly that most of it is accounts targeting a country's own people, whether that is China, Iran, or Russia. They're targeting their own people. Here's just a couple of examples. These are a couple of Cuban accounts that we identified that are inauthentic, probably run by the Cuban government. Jonathan Castillo there, his image is actually a computer amalgam of, if you give it a second, you'll probably spot it. I'm guessing a few of you have already. It's an amalgam of Justin Timberlake and Justin Bieber in one gorgeous face. And these kind of accounts, again, especially in autocratic nations, are prolific. Just a few months ago, we worked with Twitter to shut down a large number of Russian language accounts that we identified that were engaged in a way that was very consistent with I don't know for certain that these accounts were run by the Internet Research Agency, but it was very consistent with their work. And we worked with Twitter to shut down several hundred of these accounts. 400, I think, last I checked, and growing. You'll see these accounts are obviously targeting, well, being Russian, they're obviously targeting the Russian people, but they are targeting the Russian people with very specific pro-regime, pro-Putin messages. Even, we found a lot of happy birthday messages for Putin. If anybody ever wants to celebrate, it's October 6th. A lot of, at the time that we were tracking these accounts, these accounts were talking a lot about COVID-19, obviously. Not in the way you might think. They weren't necessarily saying it's, false news. These were speaking to the Russian people. They were very concerned about COVID-19 and wanted people to take the vaccine. They just wanted people to take the Russian vaccine, the Sputnik V vaccine. And they were undermining the Western vaccines. Trying to make Russia appear to be a bigger player, and make the Russians all the more glad to be Russian and realize, maybe things aren't that great in the West. We're fine here. Take the devil you know over the devil you don't. They were talking a lot about Navalny on the upper two images here, undermining him, undermining his supporters, undermining the protests that surrounding the Navalny upon his return to Russia. And they were doing this again in ways that were consistent with the way you use social media. They're doing it with memes and even cat memes. Cat is psych there. On the right is an account that we worked with Twitter to suspend that communicated entirely in cat memes. The real reason I want to talk about domestic disinformation isn't what they're doing necessarily to their own people, though that is obviously very important. But the way they shape conversations in a way that makes it much more difficult for us to engage with those countries. Here's just a couple of tweets that we found within this network that were framing conversations here in the United States in a very particular way. The one on the left there, you see that's just a Google Translate version of the tweet on the lower part of it there. You can read for yourself, but clearly they're making the suggestion that the US government was making January 6th insurrectionists disappear. You know, you should always accuse your adversaries of the sins that you're guilty of yourself, and Russia's no stranger to that idea. The one on the right is one of my favorite tweets of all time, though. That is a Russian disinformation account warning Russian speakers and the people of Russia about American disinformation on Twitter, and suggesting that you should watch your children or they'll become victims of American disinformation. So they're not only just spreading pro-regime, pro-Putin messages to their own people, and again, China's doing this, Iran's doing this, Venezuela is doing this a lot. But they're doing it in a way that makes it much more difficult to build trust, to build bridges, to engage globally with these countries, and is only going to serve to make these countries more isolationist and more anti-democratic and more anti-Western. And with that, I've talked a lot and I want to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Darren. That was a fascinating conversation. So one of the first questions is a question that we received ahead of the conversation via email. What do you think is the most common misconception that people have about online disinformation?
I think one of the most common, there's two actually that I want to mention. One of them is that it's all about fake news. That's simply untrue. A lot of online disinformation isn't about the message, it's about the spin of the message. Most of what the Russians were spreading in 2016 all the way through 2020 was real information. It was, you know, if they were going to send you a link to the news, it was going to be CNN, more likely than anything else. It was going to be some local news venue. But it was the spin that they were giving those messages that was concerning. It was the fact that they were telling you how to interpret that information when they were communicating it to their social media users that they got to follow their accounts. It was the way they worked within a particular community to make that community even more extreme, using existing messages, using existing memes and existing conversations. So that's the first thing, that disinformation isn't just fake news. A lot of it is very real. The second is that it's negative. We just finished a study here at here at Clemson in the Media Forensics Hub where we looked at how real people engaged with trolls. In particular, we were looking at Russian trolls, but I would guess that it would be the same for what we've seen out of certainly Iran and probably a lot of what China does as well. And most messages directed at trolls by presumably real users were supportive in nature. They weren't, so the trolls aren't out there fighting. They're not out there trying to get you, to fight your neighbor. They're out there to make you support their message. They're out there to make friends. It's just they're out there to make a very particular set of friends and then take that set of friends in a particular direction. So yeah, two things. One, trolls are, from the perspective of the people listening, nicer than you think. And it's not all about fake news.
Really good points. Thank you. Another question we received is, how much of a threat to Australia's state-level governments do you believe online disinformation poses?
So, I mean, the actual effect of social media disinformation is the $1,000,000 question. If I could answer that question, I'd be a much wealthier man than I am. But it is very difficult because it's extremely difficult to measure. There's no test and control group study we can do to measure the effect of disinformation, because everything's connected. You can't take the disinformation out of the equation. You don't know what knock-on effects disinformation have, how messages change and morph in bizarre and fascinating ways sometimes, across platforms and across users. And so the single biggest effect I think that disinformation has had has just caused us to have a lack of trust. A lack of trust in authenticity, a lack of trust in one another, and I think that has an effect at every level, at the state level, at the national level, whether you're in the United States or Australia, because it's now just an easy ad hominem attack to say, "Oh, I don't believe you, and I don't trust you." But it's not because I disagree with your message. It's because you're not even real. I can just, you're a troll, you're fake. And that's an easy ad hominem attack that didn't exist just a few years ago. We can disagree with people not based off of the nature of what they're saying. We cannot even engage with what they're saying. We can just dismiss that message. And I think that, I believe anyway, that we're seeing the effect of that at every level.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. The way that it's changed how people respond to maybe political or other sorts of opponents.
Yeah. And that lack of trust extends to institutions, to governments, to science. That lack of trust is unfortunately not going away.
So here's a question more on how you do your research. So how has your process for attribution for social media accounts changed over time?
It is something we do sparingly. For instance, those Chinese accounts that I was talking about a little while ago. I mean, those are pretty obvious. I'm probably not going to go write a New York Times article and attribute those to China specifically. But they're clearly some Chinese affiliated actor. And the folks at FireEye and Google agree with me. But attribution is just extremely hard. It's hard for the platforms. It's hard for researchers like us. And it's hard because it's difficult for us to communicate with one another, us researchers in the platforms. I engage with both Twitter and Facebook periodically. And often, they'll take my word, and I mean, they always listen to me, but we don't always agree. They have, very specific, they tend to be very reliant on the sort of back end things that they see, a little too reliant in my opinion. But in any case, attribution is very difficult. But, when I attributed in this conversation today a number of accounts to the Internet Research Agency, and that's not something I did even a little bit lightly. That attribution took literally years of work, understanding how the Russians were operating, the nature of their messaging, everything from aesthetics to more nuanced technical things that we knew they were doing. And even still, the platforms have been are sometimes hesitant to agree with that attribution. They often do, but they don't always.
So another kind of technical question, what are some tells that an image of a person was generated rather than authentic?
Sure, there's a couple. There's two big ones that I spot. One is the current technology, off-the-shelf technology. You can go to a website called "This Person Does Not Exist," and the website generates pictures for you. And I'm confident that's the page many of these users use to get their image. They just take a screenshot of these images. But the computer starts with the eyes and works out. So these images will have the eyes smack in the middle of the screen. Second, this program is created to create faces and nothing but faces. So backgrounds look funny. You'll see all kinds of wonky things happening in the background. And then you'll see other cues if you look closely sometimes where the hair meets a hat, or sometimes an image you'll see just the edge of a set of glasses that the computer started to create and didn't finish. So sometimes you'll spot those other things, but the two biggest ones are the eyes smack in the middle and a background that you can't tell what's going on in the background because it's a fake background. For anime fans, there's also a page called "This Waifu Does Not Exist." And the Chinese trolls use a lot of computer-generated anime pictures as their profiles.
Thank you. Another question we received, with COVID disinformation coming from state actors, are their methods similar to pre-COVID methods? And do you think their efforts have made an impact with target audiences?
That's a really interesting question. I think, first of all, methods are always changing and evolving. What I'm seeing online now is different than a year ago, which was different than a year before that. So, are their methods different because of COVID, or are they just different because it's a constant game of whack-a-mole? But yeah, they're definitely different. I think it's a lot of COVID disinformation. We've looked a lot at what the Russians have been doing, a little bit at what the Chinese have been doing. A lot of it isn't what you might think. Again, the message that the Russians were spreading is a lot of what they were spreading to their own people. It's mostly Russia's great, we're technologically advanced, the Sputnik V vaccine is amazing, you can't trust those other vaccines. There was a news release just recently that the Russians worked with a marketing firm that all of the disinformation doesn't come from the IRA. They worked with a marketing firm for a campaign that targeted the AstraZeneca vaccine. I forget the details. There's some element of the AstraZeneca vaccine that is connected to monkey DNA in some way. And so the Russians had this whole campaign about how, you're going to turn into a monkey if you take the AstraZeneca vaccine. But most of it isn't just factually incorrect, like that campaign happened to be. Most of it is just subtly spreading doubt using existing information about the Western vaccines and hyping the Russian vaccine, especially in Latin America. It's not all about the West. It's about influence globally. And they haven't been terribly successful because they've had a lot of rollout issues. But especially in Argentina, it's been a huge kerfuffle in Argentina. But they tried to use their own vaccine as a tool of diplomacy, as a tool of propaganda. And part of that was undermining the other vaccines. I think it's possible that some of the Chinese disinformation has had an effect on Western conversations, but again, it's hard to point at one thing and say that's because of disinformation.
Sure, thank you. Really interesting. So a question we received through the live chat, and this is a longer question. There's evidence that digital platforms by their design, preference, and proliferate falsehoods faster than truth. Do you agree with this premises? If so, how do we use policy to tackle the role of big technology companies in this broader problem, which has implications not just for disinformation, but also for polarization and the distortion of our political discourse?
So, it's hard to say. I've seen research as well talking about falsehoods spreading faster than truth on social media. But really what I think it fundamentally is anything splashy spreads faster than not splashy things on social media. Simple ideas spread faster than not simple ideas on social media. And misinformation, unfortunately, tends to be both simple and splashy, or splashy. The answers we get by looking at misinformation are often simpler answers than the more complex, nuanced answers of reality. The real answers also too often take time. They take research. They take detailed understanding. And misinformation is instantaneous. I remember at the start of the global pandemic, I wanted to look. I was working with a journalist on a question about COVID-19 and people saying that 5G was causing COVID-19. And I wanted to see where did it first happen? Who was the first person to say that COVID-19 was caused by 5G? And I found it in New Zealand. There was a man in New Zealand who said, and I think I'm going to get this close. This is going to be close to verbatim. He said, and COVID-19 is caused by 5G in 5, 4, 3, 2. And literally 12 hours later, people were saying it in Italy. This was like week 1 of the global pandemic. And that's because it's a simple answer when the more complex, genuine answer wasn't available. And it's because that was a message that, like I was talking about at the beginning of this conversation, where misinformation and disinformation often overlap, it was a message that was borrowing from existing narratives, existing mythologies across social media, very much like what we've seen with the QAnon phenomenon that's now on. I apologize to the world on behalf of America for giving you QAnon. But QAnon was fundamentally the same thing. It took existing narratives and put them in a new context. We see that with misinformation and disinformation all the time.
Great. One final question. What can government and business do to combat misinformation and disinformation?
It's extremely difficult. The platforms, first and foremost, I think, are the first that can do more. They're certainly taking this issue more seriously than they did in the past. When I first started working with the Twitter security team, it was like, 3 guys in a warehouse somewhere in California. And it's much more extensive now. I'm being introduced to new people. And the same is certainly true with Facebook. But at the same time, I often have the impression that they're doing just enough to make it appear that they're doing a lot. And most of what they're doing most effectively is on English language social media. If you get off of the English language social media, it's prolific. You don't have to look far to find, Russian language trolls or Spanish language trolls. So, the easiest thing that the platforms could do is make it more difficult to sign up for a completely anonymous and fast to sign up for a social media account. But that's not going to happen because, the people signing up for those accounts are the actual product, and they need their product. So I think they can still do more on a site integrity, from the site integrity perspective, especially in languages other than English, to try to control these things. I definitely think that Facebook needs to be better about working with researchers. It's a constant push and pull. There's a lot of people that work in the security side of Facebook that I know are working hard and trying to do good work, but they're always being pulled back by their lawyers, making it more difficult for them to work with people outside of the platform. I think governments are doing what they can. It's difficult for governments. I know I've worked with law enforcement. I've worked with U.S. Army Cyber Command. And U.S. Army Cyber Command is doing a lot of great work. But at the same time, you know, there's a lot of lines that they can't cross or shouldn't cross, or and so it's an uphill climb. I mean, that's one reason they do work with academics like myself, because of various things that they can't do. But I think that it's up to the governments to put the pressure on the platforms, because the last thing the world platforms want is government control, and they need to use that stick to get the platforms to take these things more seriously.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for all of your great questions. Before I turn back to Darren for his final thoughts, we want to ask you the same poll question again that we asked you at the beginning of the presentation. After today's discussion, how confident are you now that you can correctly recognize online trolls?
See the numbers dropping already.
I don't know if that's encouraging or discouraging.
The real answer is it depends on the troll. I guarantee you, if you saw a Russian troll right now, you would not know that you were looking at a troll. Other nation states are a little easier.
Thank you so much. If you enjoyed today's webinar, we encourage you to follow us on social media, where we advertise for similar events on our speaker series. We also encourage you to consider signing up for our Alliance Leadership Network. Darren, do you have any final remarks that you would like to make to our Australian friends and colleagues?
I just want to thank you again for letting me talk today. If anybody has any further questions or wants to engage in any way, feel free to reach out to me. I'm on Twitter at Darren Linvill, and my email address is darrenl, that's DARRENL, at clemson.edu. And if you have 10 minutes, we built a tool before the 2020 election called Spot the Troll. It's at spotthetroll.org, that walks you through some tactics and strategy using real accounts and fake accounts. So real humans and accounts created by the Russian IRA to show how those tactics works. And you can go and see if you actually are good at spotting Russian trolls.
Definitely recommend you check out the quiz. I've taken it and it's incredibly illuminating. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in today. Thank you, Darren, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much.
Take care.